The majority of Bolshevik elites were Ashkenazi. It's a historical fact that the majority of the Bolshevik party elite were Ashkenazi. Who were the Bolsheviks? The party that took control of government after the 1917 Russian Revolution. The far-reaching effects of this period are still felt today, communism being an ideology that never dies and keeps reinventing itself to stay alive. The Bolsheviks were communists that called themselves state atheists. Truth be told, they adapted Talmudic ideology for a secular world. In this video, I will explain who was behind the Bolshevik movement and why we'll never be able to put communism in the dustbin of history until we accept who they were. I'll start with the essential caveat for a subject this controversial. Just because most Bolshevik elites were Ashkenazi, that doesn't justify any repression of this ethnic group. Also, bear in mind that most Ashkenazim around the world weren't involved in the Bolshevik movement. It's tragic how all Europeans are constantly blamed for perceived injustices of European countries, yet if you generalise with any other racial or ethnic group, you're called racist or anti-Semitic. Ask yourself this question before I proceed. Why is it only acceptable to criticise Europeans in history, even when there are plenty of examples of historical injustice caused by other ethnic and racial groups? I never put the words Ashkenazi and Jew together because, as I've explained in the past, Ashkenazim are neither ethnic nor religious Jews. It's therefore essential that people stop using the term Ashkenazi Jew because it enables the idea that criticising this group is anti-Semitic, and by extension, criticising communism is also anti-Semitic. If you want a good reason why communism still isn't recognised as the murderous ideology that it is, this is a big part of it. People often ask why Nazism is so vilified, yet communism isn't. The answer is there's never been anything comparable to the Nazi Nuremberg trial for communism. Meanwhile, Nazism has been used as a club to bludgeon the entire of Europe, despite millions of Europeans sacrificing their lives to fight this ideology. If we're going to resolve this, we need to be honest about the Ashkenazi role in the rise of communism. To see how Bolsheviks took over Russia, we need to understand the history of the Russian Revolution that began in 1917. When this took place, it was presented as a reaction to the harsh and difficult life in Tsarist Russia for most people. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, the last Russian emperor, was considered politically naive and slow to reform Russian society, making the country one of the most backwards in Europe and a powder keg of radicalism that made it the ideal breeding ground for communism. I've already made a video about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, one of the most controversial books ever written. Some claim this book is fraudulent, but its prophetic and historical accuracy is easy to see when we compare it to the history of the Bolsheviks. The Protocols explain that the aim is to distance the people from their sovereign power and restrict the sovereign's activities through the growing demands of people inside and outside the corridors of power. From here, different groups would be pitted against one another until this leads to complete disarray. It's this setting that would allow those behind the Protocols to take power. This identical scenario played out in Russia when the Bolsheviks took over. Initially, the Russian Revolution led to the abdication of the Tsar, a provisional government, and community assemblies called Soviets. Bolsheviks had no real power early on, but this all began to change when Vladimir Lenin and other socialist leaders returned to Russia after being exiled from the country. Gradually, the Bolsheviks agitated for control and hid their totalitarian agenda from the masses until they had enough power to enact a campaign of terror, just as the Protocols outlined, that would later become known as the Red Terror. Beforehand, the Bolsheviks derided democracy and demanded a dictatorship of the proletariat be formed instead. Bolsheviks also set about creating a military from the peasants and workers that would become known as the Red Army, leading to a civil war with the nationalists in Russia, who became known as the White Army. Some historians suggest the Red Army was well trained, but it was the veteran Kronstadt sailors of the Baltic Fleet that were the backbone of the Bolshevik forces. Once the White Army was defeated, the Kronstadt sailors became disillusioned by the corruption of the Bolshevik Party and demanded that the original principles of the revolution be honoured. The protocols state that power will never be returned once it's been taken, and this is exactly what happened. The Kronstadt sailors were then crushed, just like any other Russians that opposed the Bolsheviks, marking the end of ethnic Russian resistance to Ashkenazi Bolshevik rule. In 1920, Russian correspondent for The Times, Robert Wilton, published the ethnicity of all members of the Soviet government. As a result, he was ostracized by his profession and died in poverty, like so many others, exposing Ashkenazi supremacy. Not only were the vast majority Ashkenazi, but the secret police, known as the Cheka, were also dominated by this ethnic group. This was so well established that Winston Churchill openly pointed this out during his lifetime. The protocols are dismissed as anti-Semitism spread by Russian Tsarists. Yet as far back as 1914, Lenin stated that a civil war should take place in Russia that pitted the Tsarist monarchy against the working class and the labouring masses. As we can see, the Tsarist warnings about the protocols came true, albeit Churchill wasn't aware that Lenin's mother was half Jewish. It's said Lenin himself was also unaware of this because his sister discovered it after his death. However, Leon Trotsky, second only to Lenin in the Bolshevik Party and commander of the Red Army, was well aware of his Ashkenazi heritage. More proof of the Ashkenazi origins of the Bolsheviks is American Ashkenazi banker Jacob Schiff, providing $20 million to finance this movement. While the support was initially denied after it became public, it was later confirmed by Schiff's grandson. When Lenin died, a vicious struggle for power took place in the Bolshevik Party, one that Joseph Stalin would eventually win. As expected, this was blamed on anti-Semitism. But now that we know the sheer number of Ashkenazim involved in the highest levels of government, it would be impossible for such a struggle to take place that didn't significantly affect this ethnic group. Interestingly, however, Stalin was Georgian, meaning his ethnicity is closely linked to Ashkenazi, as I've previously proven. With all this in mind, I have no doubt that the elites backing the Bolshevik movement were well aware of this genetic bond, especially given that the internationalist movement behind communism is rooted in an occult eugenics bloodline. What's more, Stalin had 3 wives in his life, all of whom were Ashkenazi, further disproving the idea he was anti-Semitic. If you factor in Armenians and other Georgians in the highest positions of Soviet government, this again indicates that a particular bloodline took control of Russia after the revolution and civil war in the country. Only after Stalin's death did ethnic Russians slowly begin to take back control of their country, and it's well known that this gradually led to a noticeable reduction in repression, though life was certainly far from perfect. Strangely enough, Cold War rhetoric heightened as Ashkenazi control of the Soviet Union began to decline, particularly when Nikita Khrushchev became leader, denouncing Stalin a few years later. The reason for this makes sense when you know your history. Ex-Trotskyites founded the neoconservative wing of the US Republican Party, coinciding with Israel moving away from the Soviet sphere of influence. They say history is written by the winners. If the Russian Revolution is anything to go by, the victory of the Bolsheviks allowed Ashkenazim to almost completely erase the ethnic origins of their cause from mainline history. Anyone that dares contradict this is vilified as anti-Semitic. This is Rocking Mystery. over and out.